right, hello. My talk today takes a look at bilingual Han and Latin script magazines to consider how typographic decisions may relate to readers' experience. Plainly put, it has always struck me that while it's common for many languages to be spoken at once in conversation, it's not on paper. But sometimes this does happen. I first started to look at this topic as part of my very recently completed master's dissertation, which included a larger study of multilingual and multi-script magazines in the lifestyle genre. But even before that, I began to wonder about this topic while working editorial jobs in Taiwan, working with Chinese and English language copy, and seeing all the things that could go right and wrong when paired together. The many design decisions surrounding how to portray the two languages can hold a great deal of power over their conveyed message, intended or otherwise. Drawing as well from a graduate background in anthropology has led me to approach these cultural objects, these magazines, from perhaps a more socially driven perspective. This quote by linguist Janice Andropoulos sums up a nice, power-driven mindset to enter when considering these typographies. The strong link between national identity and linguistic homogeneity does not automatically exclude bilingual practices from the public sphere, but rather frames their modality and meaning. Language mixing can be understood as a means of symbolic capital. That the majority of multilingual magazines being made include English demonstrates the larger social power of the language, yet the exact power is ultimately defined by the cultural group in question. This is not meant to be an exhaustive analysis of bilingual print, but a jumping-off point into a deeper inquiry about bilingual Han script editorial design, as well as to present a few publications as they actually exist. China is home to the fastest-growing publishing industry in the world. It is the second largest global contributor to magazine advertising sales. That there is this growing niche market within such an economic environment makes understanding it even more relevant as a current publishing trend. What's more, China is also home to the largest internet population. This has, of course, rerouted print sales. However, despite a largely digital readership base, publishers are still creating these rather niche magazines, and people are buying them. So some of the most popular mainstream magazines in China at the moment are Duzhe on the left, with content similar to The New Yorker, Rui Li, a fashion magazine in the middle, and Zhiyin, which is dedicated to telling marriage stories. Additionally, Chinese National Geography, as well as Chinese versions of Elle and Vogue, are in the mainstream. Of all these magazines, both in print and on the internet, the most frequently used typefaces for the Han body script by far were Simsun, Microsoft Yahoo, and Pingfang SC. The nature of the magazine allows it to hone in on specific and particular topics, acting as a conduit of exploration between the makers and the readers. More so than books or newspapers, magazines are experimental and unconventional in both content and design. Bear in mind, though, that bilingual magazines are ultimately a niche genre, comprising only a small percentage of the overall market. In a paper titled A Descriptive Framework for Chinese-English Bilingual Typographies, typeface designer Keith Tam uses linguistic terms to divide bilingual typographies into three main parts, as a visual way to analyze and organize these texts. For the most part, Han Latin script magazines fall into one category. I will use the same three categories as Tam to present some examples. So the first category is called parallel bilingualism. This describes texts translated exactly side by side. Parallel translations are the most used means of presentation. This is assumed to provide equal weight to each language. While it perhaps seems true visually, it is not always true politically or culturally. Another example is Wild magazine by the Shanghai publisher Volume Press, a magazine about stories of exploration. The texts are slightly staggered, which begins to add variety to the page, however they are ultimately parallel. Next we see Lost, a magazine of travel stories. While the texts are composed in a parallel way and further differentiated by color, the matching justification adds extra space in the English text. Pages from the German, English, and Chinese business magazine, the Global Handelsblatt, effectively presents parallel translations across many hierarchies. A few issues of balance and spacing arise in This Month in Taiwan, a tourism magazine that has been published monthly since 1974, which pairs traditional Han script and Latin. Now, as we know, the spacing of Han script punctuation is different than that of the Latin script. The former centered within a square box, and if used interchangeably, there will be an unevenness in tone in the texts. Next, I would like to show just a few examples of multilingual Latin script magazines for comparison. Now again, I chose these Latin script cases because of prevalence and availability, and to look at other forms of bilingualism in use. So the second way to consider bilingualism is codemixing, which describes a block of text within a few words or fragments of another language. Shown here are two covers from Latina, which describes itself as a magazine for bilingual, bicultural, American Latina women. Circled in red are two examples of codemixing. This is the most mainstream example of a bilingual magazine. Latina has been in successful circulation since 1996 and has millions of readers. Similarly, Alegría is another Spanish-English bilingual magazine, but it uses the two languages interchangeably, assuming complete fluency of the reader in both languages, which describes a third type of bilingualism, code switching. So in code switching and code mixing, knowledge of both languages becomes a key to accessing the publication, inviting to some, but not to all. Perhaps in clearly establishing which group this magazine is intended for, the creator secured interest and loyal readership. Code mixing and code switching certainly occurs in the Chinese language, both written and aloud. There are many examples on the Elle and Vogue websites, though not so much in the bilingual magazines. Code mixing seems to be almost exclusively seen in magazines intended only for Chinese-speaking audiences. Why exactly, then, do bilingual Han and Latin script magazines continue to be made? Is it to cast a wider net to a wider audience, to include readers of two languages, or as a marketing strategy? The value that is placed on knowledge of English and other North American and Western European languages must be considered. Perhaps sometimes there is more perceived value in the appearance of Latin script next to another script than there is in gaining a following that is fluent in both. This may be an instance of reverse inclusion or group forming, that these multi-script magazines are being used as a key to access other groups, more international groups, if you will, rather than to invite others into the group. To reiterate, looking at these examples has been a beginning and not an end. So I will, however, draw three general conclusions following these instances. First, that the increased publication of bilingual magazines is representative of a market with an expanding content and design interests. Second, that an international genre of publishing is becoming increasingly prevalent. And lastly, that multilingual text can be used as an advertising gimmick, a political statement, or multicultural necessity. Thank you.